While Washington was broadcasting its ultimatums and Tel Aviv was counting down its strike windows, something far more consequential was unfolding in the shadows, and most Americans had no idea it was happening. Beijing wasn't watching this war from the sidelines. China was actively replacing Western software inside Iran with closed Chinese systems, hardening Tehran's digital infrastructure against CIA and Mossad cyber attacks. Chinese spy ships were shadowing US carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, monitoring American naval movements, tracking missile defense activity, and feeding real-time intelligence directly to Iran. Negotiations between Beijing and Tehran for CM-302 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, weapons capable of threatening every warship the US Navy has in the Persian Gulf, were described as nearly complete. China was buying over 80% of Iran's oil exports, routing payments through backroom teapot refineries specifically designed to bypass the US-monitored banking system. And here is what nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. It was the shipment of those Chinese carrier-killer missiles that set a ticking clock and narrowed the window for diplomacy, possibly fast-forwarding this entire war. This was not neutrality. This was not diplomacy. This was a calculated, layered, and deliberate strategy, and it was happening while Beijing smiled across the negotiating table. Let's go back to the beginning of this story, because that's the only honest way to understand where we are right now. Most people who followed the news over the last few years watched the sanctions on Iran and thought to themselves, all right, the pressure is working. Washington was squeezing Tehran financially, diplomatically, militarily. Iran was being isolated. That was the narrative. That was the version of events you were supposed to believe. But behind that narrative, an entirely different story was being constructed, piece by piece, deal by deal, barrel by barrel, and Beijing was the architect of every single chapter of it. China's involvement in Iran's military and industrial programs actually dates back to 1988, right after the Iran-Iraq War, when Tehran first prioritized missile production after years of enduring Iraqi Scud attacks on Iranian cities. This is not a new relationship that sprang up overnight out of political convenience. This is a decades-long partnership that has been quietly deepening while American foreign policy was focused elsewhere. Chinese companies helped Iranian engineers develop the propulsion and guidance systems of their missile arsenal. Military analysts have concluded that Iranian ballistic missiles like the Shahab-3 relied on Chinese components. Some of the missiles that Iran transferred to Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen were believed to be copies of Chinese designs. And in exchange for all of this technical assistance, China received something it needed desperately: Iranian oil at a deep discount. That exchange is the foundation of everything that followed. Now here is where it gets really important, because this is the layer of the story that most Americans never heard. China constructed what researchers have described as a dark barter and credit system with Iran, specifically designed to bypass the SWIFT banking network and American financial sanctions. Think about what that means for a moment. SWIFT is the backbone of international banking. It is how nations move money across borders, how trade gets settled, how the global economy functions, and China, working directly with Iran, built an alternative architecture specifically to make American financial pressure irrelevant. That is not the behavior of a neutral party. That is the behavior of a deliberate strategic partner working to undermine the tools that Washington relies on to project its power. Major Chinese automakers and metals firms, including Sherry Automobile and Tongling Non-Ferrous Metals Group, operated a barter system with Iran to bypass traditional banking channels entirely. Chinese firms exported semi-knockdown car kits to Iran, where local firms assembled them into finished vehicles. Instead of cash, Chinese companies accepted shipments of Iranian copper and zinc, which were then resold through intermediaries. So you had Chinese car parts going into Iran, Iranian metals coming out, and no dollars changing hands anywhere in the transaction, no SWIFT transfers, no paper trail that Washington could easily track or sanction. And this was not a small operation happening on the fringes of the economy. China exported approximately $19 billion worth of goods to Iran between April 2024 and March 2025. That is billions of dollars of economic activity flowing into a country that the United States government officially designated as one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on the planet. Beyond the barter arrangements, Beijing utilized a covert funding conduit referred to as Chuxin, whereby Iranian oil shipments funded Chinese state-backed infrastructure projects rather than cash transfers. Iranian crude would flow east, and in return Chinese contractors would show up in Tehran and build rail lines, ports, and industrial facilities. The oil was the payment, the infrastructure was the receipt, and none of it touched the dollar-denominated financial system that America controls. Independent Chinese teapot refineries accepted Iranian oil, with the origin knowingly misreported in Chinese customs data, and payments were processed by regional banks connected through varying degrees of separation to the international financial system via opaque networks of intermediaries and shell companies. This was not a loophole being accidentally exploited. This was a system purposefully engineered, at scale, with the full awareness and blessing of the Chinese Communist Party. And then there is the oil number itself, which deserves to be said plainly. China purchases approximately 90% of Iran's total oil exports, which reached a peak of 1.38 million barrels per day on average in 2025. This revenue stream provides the Revolutionary Guards with billions of dollars per year, despite American sanctions and the snapback sanctions activated by Germany, Britain, and France in September 2025. Billions of dollars every single year flowing into the IRGC, the organization that funds Iran's proxy networks, its missile programs, its regional operations across the entire Middle East, because China decided that its energy needs and its strategic interests were more important than any American pressure campaign. And Washington knew this was happening. It was not a secret. It was a policy failure being dressed up as a policy, and Beijing was counting on that. Now let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the story becomes something much bigger than an oil trade. After the 12-day war in June 2025, when Israel bombed Iran's air defense systems into rubble and assassinated Iranian commanders from the air, Tehran turned immediately to Beijing, not Moscow, Beijing. China expedited delivery of its HQ-9B long-range surface-to-air defense system and its YLC-8B radar, and a Hudson Institute report described Beijing as offering Iran complete and deployable systems with flexible financial terms, something Moscow simply could not match. Russia had given its best air defense systems to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Iran got the leftovers. China stepped in to fill that gap and became what analysts began calling Iran's total solution provider. China supplied Iran with the YLC-8B system specifically designed to track American stealth aircraft and conduct electronic surveillance. Let that land for a second. The United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars developing stealth technology. The F-22, the F-35, the B-2, aircraft designed specifically to be invisible to radar. And China handed Iran the radar system engineered to find them. That is not a defensive gesture. That is a direct counter to America's most significant tactical advantage in any conflict in that region. China also supplied loitering munitions to replenish Iranian stockpiles, and negotiations intensified over the CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missile and the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle. These are not minor weapons. The CM-302 is a carrier killer, a missile designed specifically to defeat the layered defenses of an American naval strike group and put a hole in one of the most powerful warships ever built. When you understand what that missile is designed to do, the negotiations around its transfer to Iran stop being a footnote and start being the headline. China was also delivering offensive weapons, including loitering munitions, what the military calls kamikaze drones, to Iran, with the US on the cusp of launching an attack on the Islamic Republic. According to officials familiar with the deliveries, these are not air defense systems. These are weapons designed to seek out targets and destroy them. The distinction matters enormously because China had spent months publicly positioning itself as a neutral diplomatic actor, calling for restraint and dialogue. What it was doing privately was arming Tehran with offensive strike capability, while that diplomatic theater was still playing out on the world stage. But perhaps the single most consequential thing China did, and this is the piece that almost nobody in mainstream American media adequately explained, was the navigation transition. During the 12-day war in June 2025, Iran relied heavily on Western-controlled GPS for drone and ballistic missile targeting, and widespread GPS jamming by the United States and Israel drastically reduced the accuracy of Iranian strike packages and enabled Israeli jets to fly over Iran almost unopposed. Iran launched hundreds of missiles. Many of them missed because their guidance systems were being scrambled by American and Israeli electronic warfare. That was a lesson Tehran absorbed immediately and completely. On June 23, 2025, Iran formally deactivated GPS reception nationwide and completed its national transition to China's Beidou satellite navigation system for both military and civilian use. This transition is one of the most significant military technology transfers in the modern era, and it received almost no serious attention in American public discourse. Beidou's military-grade accuracy reportedly reaches centimeter-level precision for authorized users, offering a substantial improvement over civilian GPS accuracy of 3 to 5 meters, directly enhancing the effectiveness of precision-guided munitions, long-range strike systems, and time-sensitive targeting chains within Iran's integrated air and missile forces. And because Beidou is a Chinese system, America cannot jam it or spoof it the way it could jam GPS, because doing so would be an act of electronic warfare against Chinese sovereign infrastructure, a line that carries entirely different consequences. Iran also gained access to China's encrypted, high-precision military signals that are resistant to Western jamming, and China used its fleet of over 500 satellites to support Iran with signals intelligence and help track American naval movements in the Persian Gulf. Chinese satellites watching American carriers, Chinese navigation systems guiding Iranian missiles. That is the operational picture that existed when Operation Epic Fury began on February 28, 2026. Now understand the intelligence dimension of what China was getting out of all of this, because Beijing is not a charity. Every piece of technology it transferred to Iran was also an experiment. Beijing would use Iranian combat data to refine its own missile and radar systems, and if the conflict continued for weeks, China might provide more hardware to test software updates in active war zones. Iran's battlefield was a live laboratory for Chinese weapon systems, facing the most advanced Western countermeasures in existence. If Russia gained crucial military intelligence on Western armaments from the Ukraine conflict, China was positioned to gain the same from the Middle East, without losing a single Chinese soldier, without spending a single yuan on direct military intervention, and without attracting the kind of political blowback that direct involvement would have triggered. Iran's discounted oil gives China substantial cost savings, helping it compete in its trade war with the United States, and is critical to China's plans regarding Taiwan. This is the thread that ties everything together, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every barrel of cheap Iranian oil that flows into a Chinese teapot refinery is a barrel that strengthens Beijing's economic position against Washington. Every dollar China does not spend on market-rate oil is a dollar it can redirect toward its military modernization, its semiconductor industry, its Belt and Road investments. The war in Iran was not just a Middle Eastern conflict, it was a resource in China's broader competition with the United States, and Beijing managed it with the cold, patient precision of a player who understands that the real game is not the one being fought in Iranian skies, it is the one being prepared for in the Taiwan Strait. Defense officials within U.S. Central Command warned that the high expenditure of Standard Missile-3 and Tomahawk missiles risked a Winchester scenario of complete ammunition depletion, and this munitions drain could force the U.S. to divert stocks from the Pacific, potentially compromising military readiness against China to sustain ongoing operations against Iran. There it is. The strategic logic Beijing had been counting on, playing out in real time. Every SM-3 interceptor fired at an Iranian drone was one fewer interceptor available to defend Taiwan. Every Tomahawk launched at an Iranian missile battery was one fewer Tomahawk in the magazines of the Pacific Fleet. A January 2026 Heritage Foundation report warned that high-end interceptors such as SM-3, SM-6, PAC-3, and THAAD would likely be exhausted within days of sustained combat, with aggregate American vertical launch system inventories insufficient for even one full fleet reload. China did not need to fire a single shot. It just needed Iran to keep fighting long enough to drain American magazines. This intermittent cycle of contained escalation in Iran served Beijing's objectives by increasing the strategic cost of America's posture in the Gulf, distracting Washington from confronting China in the Indo-Pacific, and slowly depleting its military and financial resources. That assessment came from Chatham House, one of the most respected foreign policy institutions in the world. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was a clear-eyed reading of Chinese strategic behavior, and the most remarkable thing about it is how openly Beijing pursued this strategy while continuing to issue statements about respecting sovereignty and calling for diplomatic solutions. The gap between what China said and what China did was not a subtle contradiction. It was a fundamental description of how Beijing operates, speaking the language of international law while systematically dismantling the architecture that makes American power enforcement possible. China's entire Middle Eastern architecture suffered a catastrophic blow when Operation Epic Fury killed Ayatollah Khamenei and his inner circle, collapsing the bespoke barter ecosystem that Beijing had spent years constructing, destroying the yuan-based oil settlement network anchored by Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, and dealing what analysts described as a devastating blow to Beijing's flagship de-dollarization strategy. The very system China had built to insulate itself from American financial leverage, the shadow fleet, the teapot refineries, the barter networks, the Chuksin conduit, the Beidou integration, all of it depended on an Iranian government that was still standing. When that government was decapitated, the architecture that Beijing had invested decades and hundreds of billions of dollars in constructing collapsed alongside it. And that tells you something profound about the stakes China had placed on this relationship and about the degree to which Washington understood, even if it rarely said it publicly, that confronting Iran was also, in a very real and measurable sense, a confrontation with the system that China had built to challenge American dominance. This is not a story about one country secretly helping another country during a war. This is a story about an entirely parallel world order being constructed in real time with its own financial rails, its own satellite navigation systems, its own weapons supply chains, its own intelligence networks, all of it designed to make American sanctions irrelevant, American military technology less decisive, and American global leadership less certain. That is what China's support for Iran actually was. And that is why it matters to every single person in this country, regardless of what you think about the Middle East, regardless of what you think about sanctions, regardless of what you think about any of the political players involved. The world that is being built in the shadows of this conflict is one where the tools America has relied on for 80 years to maintain its global position are becoming systematically less effective, and Beijing calculated every single step of it